Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining this seminar, where we will look at the vital role of the Livery in supporting the corporation's climate action strategy and ensuring the city meets the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. I am very glad the Livery companies have established this core group. A huge thank you to Alderman Alison Gowman for initiating and spearheading this programme of work. And a thank you very much to our two guest speakers, Professor David Viner and Raphaelle Vallet from the Green Investment Group at Macquarie. The Climate Action Strategy is our response to the greatest challenge which our world faces. This strategy positions the City of London as a thriving city for the future. This is my top priority for the remainder of my term, as I hope a green Lord Mayor. Our strategy will make the square mile net zero carbon emission by 2040, 10 years earlier than government goals. We will reach net zero across our own operations much sooner, by 2027. This involves investing £68 million in fighting climate change over the first 6 years, creating 800 green jobs. It also means revolutionising the way our planning regulations work, so that all new developments include carbon reduction plans. The cityscape will change, with more greenery on roofs and walls. And just as we've been asking of all financial institutions, climate will have to be part of all our decisions. The city must and will lead by example. In this way, a green square mile will be a crucial step along the green brick road to COP26 in Glasgow later this year, where the City of London will be running a virtual Green Horizon Summit at COP26, GHS at COP26, to showcase what has been achieved and to secure commitments to further action. We need the ongoing support of the city's livery companies to make our strategy a success. The Livery-owned city venues represent our different industries, contribute to our civic life, and crucially help to train and educate the next generation. You are already contributing to the climate action strategy, and I am aware of a number of excellent initiatives which are underway. It might be unfair to pick out specific examples, but I'm going to mention a few. The Wax Chandlers have initiated the Pollinating London project, with considerable support from other companies. The Water Conservators have been working to achieve a plastic-free city. The Gardeners are running a series of green city briefings, including one which I spoke at this week. Many companies have carried out ethical reviews of their financial investments. And Livery working groups have been founded to do further work in areas such as green investment, carbon capture, and energy efficiency. I hope this evening's seminar will help you share knowledge about the climate action strategy, the Sustainable Development Goals, and the role of livery companies in achieving them. Thank you for all you are doing to help make this a green city.
Well, thank you very much, my Lord Mayor. It's great to have your enthusiasm and your endorsement of all the work around climate action, and in particular this initiative by the livery companies and their membership. The Lord Mayor, as people know, has been a real champion of this work, and in particular been promoting green finance during his mayoralty. I think he mentioned green several times. He is the Green Lord Mayor on the Green Road to COP26. The Green Horizon Summit last year in November was a real success, based virtually in the city. And as he said, there are more talks coming up through discussions with the business sector in order to ensure that we are doing all that we can as a global financial city to transition. Now, I'm Alison Gowman. The Lord Mayor kindly mentioned me. I'm one of the aldermen, and I'm very pleased to be involved in and trying to lead this group. Some of you have attended the first seminar that we held in January, and this is what sparked a whole series of work streams that have been working since the end of January and have led to this second seminar. Those work streams are considering the topics that we think are the pressing elements for livery companies. That's the impact of financial investment, the impact on property, upskilling our knowledge and that of our future generations, schools and universities. We're also looking at creating a charter that livery companies may want to sign up to. And we're also looking at how we can respond to COP26, the climate conference to be held in November in Glasgow, but with a parallel associated conference here in London. So this seminar has been planned by the education group to take us on another step along the road to consider the sustainable development goals and what they mean. And to guide our discussions and provide us with more information about these difficult areas, perhaps not so obvious to everybody, we have two experts, and I'm so delighted that they're here to help us out. We've got David Viner and Raphaelle Vallet, that the Lord Mayor also mentioned. Now, David has nearly 30 years of experience in the global climate change agenda. He's one of the few individuals I think I know that spanned really the private sector, policy, academia, and the NGO communities, and now the private sector. And to be honest, there was so much in his career that I just couldn't possibly even précis it. But let me say that now he is an associate director at the Green Investment Group at Macquarie and leads the team involved in ensuring their investments are aligned to the global green transition. And our second speaker is his colleague from Green Investment Group, Raphaelle Vallet, the Sustainable Finance Manager. And she leads on the Macquarie strategy for COP26, helping to implement net zero policies. And such is the esteem she's held in. She's seconded one day a week to help the UK government, the Cabinet Office, on their green finance for COP26. She also has an amazing international career. Anyway, let me move on to them.
Honourable ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your time this evening and to give me this opportunity and Raphaelle's opportunity to speak to you about what is probably one of the most important issues that humanity faces. And I say that, I don't say that lightly. This is a serious issue which is growing in the need to react day by day. I work at the Green Investment Group. The Green Investment Group is part of Macquarie Capital, which is a large financial institution. We are working across the world to accelerate the green transition. But our history lies in the UK with the Green Investment Bank, which was established in 2010, and Macquarie took over in 2017, 2018. We deploy and invest in large-scale renewable energy around the world. We help clients around the world transition to renewable energy systems, and we provide a range of green advisory services as well. We work globally. We have 450 staff. We work in 25 markets. We have a development pipeline of about 30 gigawatts or more now of renewable energy. And we have helped reduce global emissions by some 181,000 tonnes. And we have a range of new projects, new infrastructure projects, new energy sources projects coming online as well. The challenge in what we do is that we are also governed quite comprehensively by the Green Purposes Company. This is part of our agreement with the UK government to ensure that we will continue to invest in green projects. So the Green Purposes Company has a golden share in GIG, and we can't alter our mandate without their approval. They help oversee everything we do. So we are governed in a way that makes us unique and ensures that we meet our requirements and our commitments that we have made publicly. Now, in terms of the presentation, I was asked by Heather to speak. One of my roles is a fellow at the Institute of Environmental Sciences, where I met Heather. So very grateful for her for this opportunity, is to just go back and where we really are on climate change, where the science tells us we are, and then Raphaelle will introduce the policy issues around what's happening at a global scale and national scale as well. The work that we do and the science I present is been drawn up from my experience over 30 years. One of my other roles is a coordinating lead author of the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which produces the science which underpins the climate negotiations. And the sixth assessment report, or somewhat delayed now because of COVID, starts to be rolled out in July this year. And that will help inform the negotiations about where we are, and it will help inform what to do and what is needed to be done. And the IPCC has been going since 1988, and it's a privilege of mine to have been involved in that for nearly the last 30 years as well. But in terms of where we are, let's just go back. 100,000 years ago, we as a species, Homo sapiens, shared the planet with at least 6 other human species. That's changed over time. We are the only ones left. 70,000 years ago, it's been identified that the cognitive revolution started. Homo sapiens started to think in a different way, started to behave in a different way, and started to modify the environment in which it lived. 12,000 years ago, the first major change happened, the agricultural revolution. We moved from hunter-gatherers into settlers. We began to settle, we developed villages, we developed communities, we developed towns, and we developed the social hierarchy that accompanied that as well. If someone was around 2,000 years ago and then was transported to 500 years ago, not much would have happened. Not much technological change had happened. In fact, it's gone backwards to some extent after some civilizations came and went. But 500 years ago, the scientific revolution started. That started to change how we perceived our place in the world and in the universe as well. Scientists like Galileo expanding our knowledge. And then 250 years ago, the spark, the Industrial Revolution kicked off. And what we now know as the Anthropocene, where we can determine that there is a human fingerprint upon where we live. The Industrial Revolution enabled us to enact large-scale changes to the landscape in which we lived, change farming practices, industrial practices, and more importantly, as we now know, started to alter the composition of the atmosphere very markedly. In fact, a lot made the atmosphere, the composition change radically compared to where it had been in the past. Part of the success of Homo sapiens and the way in which life has evolved is the greenhouse Earth. We live on a planet in which the sun dominates the energy supply. Incoming shortwave radiation enters the atmosphere, some of which is reflected back to space, but the sun's energy warms the Earth's surface. And that warming then releases long-wave radiation back into space. And the naturally occurring greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, water vapor, methane, trap some of that outgoing long-wave radiation. Without those greenhouse gases, it's estimated that the Earth would be some 50 degrees Celsius cooler than it is now. It'd be a giant snowball. And just to point out, this is a schematic, the Earth is not really flat. So those greenhouse gases are naturally occurring. But since the Industrial Revolution, we've altered the composition. The graph here shows the carbon dioxide concentration over the last 800,000 years. That is obtained from ice cores, tiny bubbles of air trapped in deep layers of ice. And we've been able to accurately measure how the concentration of carbon dioxide and other gases in the atmosphere has changed over time. And we know in the last million years or so, the atmospheric concentration has varied between 190 to about 280 parts per million. The maximum level is about 280, 290 parts per million. In the last 200 years, the concentration of carbon dioxide has increased rapidly, far faster than anything naturally occurring. We're now at about 420 parts per million, way above the naturally occurring level. And we know the sources of this is down to the burning of fossil fuels and changes in land use as well. So the human species has had a dramatic impact on the planet. We evolved in a period of time over the last 100,000 years, at the end of a warm period and into the glacial warm period, and then the Earth cooled and we had the glaciers. And this cyclical effect is caused by long-term changes in the solar and Earth orbit. As more radiation hits the Earth from the sun, due to orbital changes, the planet warms up, the terrestrial biosphere kicks in, more CO2 in the atmosphere. And when solar radiation declines, Earth cools, so biosphere declines, glaciers extend over most of the the northern latitudes and southern latitudes. So this is a well understood mechanism, coupled to our understanding of the greenhouse effect and the role of greenhouse gases within that. The resultant cause of that in the observational record is that the world has warmed dramatically. Every decade for the last 5 decades has been warmer than the previous one. The last decade, the 2010, were warmer than the 2000s, which were warmer than the 1990s, which were warmer than the 1980s, etc. And this is a result of the trapping of more heat. And this is the global air temperature. If we look at the oceans, 90% of that energy that is trapped by the increasing concentration of the greenhouse gases is trapped within the oceans. They are the radiator, they are the energy system of the planet. The manifestation of what we see as global air temperature is what we feel on a day-to-day basis. What that means, this is the snapshot from March 2021, is that the world is warming. The graph, the chart on your left as you look are the changes in absolute temperature compared to the average. So for any given month, some parts of the world will be warmer, other parts will be slightly cooler. We see very warm temperatures here over Asia, cooler temperatures over the northern latitudes. Those cooler temperatures and those warmer temperatures we can look at in terms of percentiles, so we know what that looks like on a more average basis. It gives us a more comprehensive view of what's going on. But we know globally, when averaged together, the temperature is increasing. In terms of what that means on a monthly basis, the major anomalies around the world, picked up and charted by NOAA in the US, are very much on the warm side. Asia had its 9th warmest March on record. South America was March was its 16th. Africa the 11th. So not everywhere warms uniformly. There's differentiation around the place, but across those surface areas, we know that warming is occurring. As the world warms up, what we will see is an increased warming in the northern latitudes and the southern latitudes, and less warming over the equator, and the land surface temperature will warm faster than the oceans because of the inertia that exists within the deep oceans. For England, there's a lot more variability. The British Isles is 4% of the world's land surface, so we get a lot more variability. So we don't see that global signal of temperature rise within this in the UK. And at the moment, April is relatively cool. It is actually below the average, whereas this time last year, April was way above average. So we see this year-to-year variability within at a smaller scale. The smaller we go, and this is the manifestation of weather. The Central England temperature record here is the longest observed record in the world. Goes back to 1659, and we also have a comprehensive coverage of rainfall as well. But this is a representative sample for Central England. The way in this impacts itself is that we are seeing changes in weather, changes in climate, changes in extreme events around the world. And within the UK, we know that winters are getting warmer. We know that summers are getting warmer. We know there's an increase in rainfall, particularly in the winter time, but we're seeing more year-to-year variability. And some of the factors that drive that variability are known: changes in the North Atlantic circulation, changes in the jet stream. Others are less known, and we have larger scale global circulation patterns such as the El Nino Southern Oscillation, which govern large parts of the world as well. And what causes those is still under scientific review. We know what the changes are, but not always the cause. There are issues to deal with deep ocean currents, areas of the world that we don't often have good comprehensive measurements for, but we know over time the temperature will continue to rise. This graph somewhat can appear to be complicated, but the line on the bottom, this goes back to 200,000 years, is the temperature change we've seen over the last 200,000 years. Peaked around 100,000 years ago and then declined slightly as we entered the Ice Age. We've now seen the warming now of the last 140 years, which has taken us above that natural envelope of natural variability. On the far right-hand side, we see the estimates for the future. RCP is the representative concentration pathways. These are scenarios of the future for this century alone. And depending on what the emissions trajectory is, will determine the rate of warming. But all of these take us above the naturally occurring level. The world community has been negotiating around climate change for 30 years. I've been involved in this area since the world really first started to take action. The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change was signed in 1992. We've had a range of protocols ever since. But the defining moment was in Paris, almost 6 years ago now, where the world agreed, the governments of the world, not just the scientists, it was based upon the scientific evidence provided by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, but the world agreed that going above 2 degrees Celsius, global mean temperature change of 2 degrees Celsius, above pre-industrial, we're already over 1 degrees into that, would be dangerous. And why is it dangerous? Because we know from our scientific understanding and the scientific evidence that certain major changes will happen. So the Paris range defined by the grey bar, and then what we call these burning embers, this orange to red scale, represent certain key systems. So on the left-hand side, WAS is the West Antarctic ice sheet. So as we near 2 degrees, in fact, where we are now, we know that the West Antarctic ice sheet, which contains a vast amount of water, which will raise sea levels considerably if it melts in its entirety, is under threat and will start to destabilize. We know the Greenland ice sheet will start to destabilize and move more rapidly, and the evidence and the impact and the observational impacts demonstrate that. The Arctic summer sea ice extent will become more and more apparent. We're now moving to an area now where the Arctic sea ice extent is dramatically less than it was, and it's also thinner than it was. And there's feedback mechanisms there. As the Arctic becomes ice-free, the albedo changes, the reflectivity changes from ice, which reflects a lot of solar radiation back into darker water, which will absorb more radiation. So we get these positive feedback loops as well, which may cause acceleration in temperature rise and other knock-on impacts upon Northern Hemisphere weather. We know alpine glaciers are under threat. Most of the glacial regions of the world, what's generically called alpine, are receding. They're receding rapidly, and that many of the iconic ones, the Swiss Alps, are under threat of becoming ice-free very quickly. And coral reefs, this is really the canary in the coal mine. Below 2 degrees above pre-industrial, 90% of the world's coral reefs will be under threat. And we know that from observations. We have these large-scale coral bleaching events, which affect most of the world's coral reefs. So even if we keep below 2 degrees, we're still going to see profound changes that will exist and manifest themselves for many decades and centuries to come. If we don't keep above Paris, if we move into the higher levels of global warming, that we will see, if we don't react, we don't reduce emissions, we will see consequences that are far more dangerous. Complete dieback of the Amazon rainforest, loss of the boreal forest, the thermohaline circulation, one of the major oceanic currents in the world, will change and maybe stop. The Sahel will change considerably as well. And then above into the very high end where the emissions projections are now, if we carry on without any emissions reductions and carry on the pathway we are now, we will see the collapse of the East Antarctic ice sheet, permafrost melt, which will release vast amounts of carbon dioxide and methane back into the atmosphere. The Arctic will become ice-free as well. So we know that there's a whole series of major global systems that are under threat. So we do not keep below Paris and this 2 degree guardrail, we will see very profound impact. And even if we do manage to keep below 2 degrees, we will see profound impact for some key systems around the world as well. So that is why this 2 degrees threshold is important. There's also another target of 1.5 degrees, which is only some 0.4 degrees Celsius away from where we are now, which is really aimed at addressing the threats to low-lying areas of the world and the small island states as well. So small island states really want the world to keep the temperature below 1.5 degrees Celsius. So what does that mean? Raphaelle will talk about this more in detail, but in simple terms, we have to stop emitting carbon dioxide. We know the cause of climate change and global warming is down to emissions and increased concentrations of atmospheric greenhouse gases. We have to turn around what is a continuing upward trajectory of emissions into one where we see a rapid decline in emissions. And by the middle of this century, 30 years from now, we will have to have hit what we call net negative. We will have to be in a position where we have got in place systems, solutions that will be absorbing more carbon dioxide than the world is emitting. So that's a transformational change in the way we use and supply energy. No more oil. So to meet this, the basics are coal will have to exit the energy mix by the end of this decade, oil by the end of the 2030s, and gas will only be a backup by the 2050s. That's the level of change that we have to go for. So in terms of where we are now, I'll hand over to Raph, and she will talk about the requirements for net zero and the policy implications around that. Raph, over to you.
Great, thanks, David, and thank you so much for having us tonight. So yeah, just to reiterate what David was starting to touch on, just because the connection between this term net zero and different degrees of warming isn't always clear. So the current thinking, and I think this is going to get tighter and tighter as the climate science continues to evolve, is that if we're going to limit global warming to 2 degrees by the end of the century, we need to get to that net zero emission point towards the 2070s. But increasingly, we're now talking about limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees by the end of the century. And currently, that means hitting that net zero point globally by 2050. And that's likely to become nearer and nearer to us. And I think increasingly, we're going to start talking about the 2040s as well. So a huge global challenge. And if you get to the next slide, David. So the good news is the vast majority of countries around the world have started to respond to that with legislation, regulation, and targets. So in terms of targets, actually, my slide is already out of date. But countries representing just over half of global GDP have committed to limiting their own emissions on their territory to net zero to 2050. To get there, or even earlier in some cases. So we're seeing great progress on targets. And then these are being increasingly translated into laws and regulation. The UK has been a real leader in this space with the highest number of laws and regulations on the environment and carbon. They were also the first to legislate on that. So in 2008, we had the Climate Change Act. Just in 2019, the UK was also the first in the world to commit to 2050. And we're just seeing increasingly more and more specific targets and policies come in. So you will have heard last year, we are now banning the sale of petrol and diesel cars from 2030 in the UK, and I think much of Europe. France has announced a carbon price. So things are starting to really catch up in the legal space. Just the next slide. The bad news is it's still not enough to get us to where we are. So we want to be on that green pathway to hit 1.5 degrees. Current targets get us onto that orange line, so to about 2 degrees of warming, but the actual policies and regulations in place, if they get implemented properly and enforced properly, get us still to about 3 degrees of warming. And that really gives you a scale of the challenge because countries are really doing their best. And especially in Europe and in the UK, we're seeing a real acceleration of that. But yeah, we're still not there yet. And I'll expand on that a little bit. Just on the next slide. So what's the process by which we get to one of these lower color bands with policies and regulation? And that's COP. And I'm sure you will have heard the term, stands for Conference of the Parties. It's hosted by the UN, and it's more specifically the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, or the UNFCCC. It's been hosted every single year since 1992. The presidency of that rotates every year to different countries and different continents. So this year it's being hosted by the UK and Italy for Western Europe. The last COP was in Latin America. The next one will be an African country. That's not been announced yet. And in practice, it lasts about 2 to 3 weeks. And that's the point at which all countries negotiate what they're going to do to tackle climate change globally. And then that gets translated into national legislation. So it's a very large negotiation exercise. Heads of states turn up. So it really happens at the highest level of politics and government. And yeah, it dominates the news generally in November. So we're hoping to have COP26 this year in November as well. And just to the next one, so David mentioned the Paris Agreement. That was really the landmark point in that series of negotiations. We finally signed a legally binding agreement between over 190 countries that where everybody agreed that we need to act to limit global warming to ideally 2 degrees, well, to 2 degrees, but ideally 1.5 degrees. And I think two things made this a landmark point in climate negotiations, other than the text as a whole. The first one is, I would say before Paris, this whole process was top down. So the UN would kind of dictate to countries what they needed to do about climate, and that didn't always land very well. And that led to strong distinctions between what developed countries would do versus what developing countries would do. And it was very much based on responsibility. So the fact that developed nations had been polluting and emitting carbon for longer meant that they had to take more responsibility to decarbonize. And they really flipped that on its head at Paris Agreement. So now every single country has to come up to the table every year with their own plan for decarbonizing their economies. And we call them the NDCs, or the nationally determined contributions, where every single country goes away for the year and thinks about which bits of the economy they can decarbonize, and then they put that on the table, and every 5 years now they're being asked to review and ramp that up and ramp up ambition, which is what makes COP26 so important, because it's that first 5-year point where we're expecting every single country to just be that little bit more ambitious. I think the second thing that made it really groundbreaking, if you think back to that first graph I showed where we're just not on track with policies, was actually, I think, a realization from governments that they can't get there on their own. There's not enough public finance out there to subsidize our way out of these difficult questions. There's not always enough political appetite to get there either. And so there will be a huge reliance on the private sector to get us there, and especially the finance sector. So actually there are some language and some articles in the Paris Agreement on specifically aligning flows of private finance and private investment with these targets. And that's completely changed the conversation for us in the banking sector as actually being central actors to how we get there. So actually we're financing the vast majority of infrastructure around the world, not just us, Macquarie, but the banks in general. And so we have a responsibility in making sure we align our investment strategies with what the climate needs as well. Just on the next one, another thing the world did in 2015, it was a very productive year, was signing up to the Sustainable Development Goals, or the SDGs, also endorsed by the UN. With and this is essentially, the 17 things we need to see around the world for us to consider we've got a good quality of life, simply enough. So it embeds a very vast range of goals around the environment, climate, but also social, economic, education, gender equality. So it's extremely wide-ranging and increasingly accepted as the framework for quality of life in general, I guess. And I'll touch very quickly on this super important principle around the SDGs, which is leave no one behind. So we can't consider that we've achieved the SDGs if we still have some communities in Nepal, in Africa, who don't have access to schools, don't have access to clean water or to electricity. So this is very much a whole planet exercise. And that's translating as well in climate works, where we're talking about the just transition, for example. We know that a lot of these sectors that David mentioned that we need to phase out are actually very much locally based and community based. So entire communities will be involved in coal mining and in oil drilling. And so we need to make sure that as we transition to different technologies, we don't leave these communities behind, and everybody continues to have access to good quality jobs as well. And just quickly on the last one, so COP26 is on the horizon for this year in November. A lot of their themes, energy transition, clean transport, finance, nature, increasingly is becoming a part of these conversations, will be on the table. It's, I think since Paris, COPs are getting more and more tricky in a way, because the Paris Agreement was really agreeing the kind of high level agreement of where we need to go. It's about 30 pages, so not a very big document in the grand scheme of things. And now these COPs, and especially COP26, not only do we need to ramp up ambition, but we also need to get into the nitty gritty details of how we actually get there. And it's incredibly challenging for every government in the world, because when they were before asked to comment on climate objectives as a whole, now they're needed to have an actual opinion and enact things like, how do we trade carbon emissions? How do we approach financial reporting in the context of climate? And it's getting just extremely technical for them. But some of the really big, and this is our opinion, by the way, this isn't a co-published thing, on what I think their priorities are this year will be really to mainstream that concept of net zero, and not just for countries, but for the private sector and for financial sector. So you can see on the right-hand graph, an increasing amount of private sector companies are signing up to science-based targets for climate, which is brilliant. Also increasing the number of commitments from countries that are a bit more short-term. So we all agree we need to get to net zero by 2050, but we now need to articulate, what does that mean for the next 5 years? What are our interim targets for 2030? What exactly are we doing today to get there? And so the UK will push really hard for countries to articulate that. And then lastly, just continuing on that trend set by the Paris Agreement, where we're really holding the finance sector to account and getting them much more at the table talking about climate.
So can I just round up by saying to everybody, thank you so much for joining us again tonight. I can't tell you the date of the next event because we haven't planned one yet, but we will be doing a few more. And if there's any topics that you think you'd like to hear about in this context, or even if you'd like just a small seminar, I'm offering it now, to your livery about a particular topic, I'm sure we would be able to easily find speakers for you and mold it to what you want. So I have a couple, if not more than a couple, thanks. First of all, to David Viner and Raphaelle Vallet for their wonderful take to sort of explain climate change and all the impact in a very short space of time, really, with graphs. Those will all be sent round if you want to have a look at them again and understand them fully. So thank you very much. I want to thank very much Heather Barrett-Mould and Avril MacDonald, who lead our education group and put this seminar together. Thank you very much. As I say, it'll be the first of many, but it's very kind of you. Big round of applause to the information technologists who kindly stepped in to host this, and Melissa Mayer in particular, who put all our technical stuff together, working with our colleague Paul Singh, a real collaborative effort. And thank you for our audience indeed. And we will send you a little feedback of what's gone on today, so you'll be reminded. If you want to keep in touch, please let us know. I also want to thank the Lord Mayor for his visit and for his enthusiasm and endorsement of this. And I know it's appearing in his coffee mornings he's having with Livery Masters. So we are hitting the highlights. It's brilliant. Otherwise, thank you all very much indeed. And I will say good night.